My name is Justus Baird. I am a senior vice president at the Shalom Hartman Institute in North America, where I direct the Research Center for North America, and I oversee our interfaith and intergroup work. And I'm really excited to be in conversation tonight about campus, which I think everyone is talking about and everyone has a pretty strong opinion about. And I've been thinking about why that might be, and I think one reason is because I actually looked up the statistics. America, it's a place that's familiar to us because so many American Jews actually go to college. 80% of American Jews go to college, and that's more than the 60% from the general American population. And I think the number was 59% of American Jews graduate from college, which is double the 29% of the general population. So this is a place we've invested in. So that's one reason I think we care about this conversation. Another reason we really care about this conversation is because we know these places. Either you're an alum of a place, or you have a student there, a beloved person, or you know a faculty member, or you know a staff person. And so I'm guessing that all of you have at least one campus tonight that is on your heart and in your mind. And I invite you to keep that campus close in your thoughts as we're having this conversation. But I also want to remind you that there's probably a few hundred campuses that Jews are on in North America. I think I saw a number of 6,000 colleges and universities. So there is no one story about what's going on campus. The whole theme of danger of a single story, I think, really applies to this one. So just keep that in mind as we talk tonight. And the last thing I want to say before I introduce our guests is that there are many perspectives that you can have this conversation about campus from. You could focus on the student voice, right? There's a whole version of this conversation from the perspective of students. You could have an entire conversation from the perspective of Hillel professionals, campus professionals, or Chabad communities. You could have this conversation from the perspective of faculty and administrators. And you can have this conversation from the perspective of the Jewish community, if you will, who's thinking about this and being affected by the conversation nationally and internationally. So we're going to focus mostly on the last two of those versions, the faculty and Jewish community perspective. And I also want to remind you that on Monday after lunch, you have an opportunity to really go in depth and hear about the perspective of rabbis on campus. There are some amazing campus rabbis here who are going to be talking about their perspective as well. So with that background, I want to say one last thing, which is everyone, I invited you to say your own campus. I have a campus like that for me. I'll just put it out there, which is Princeton. Not because I went to Princeton, but because I was a Hillel Rebbitzin for 17 years. And my wife was the Hillel director there until a couple years ago. And let's just say I have a lot of Hillel pillow talk during those years. I have plenty and plenty of stories about what goes on campus. So for me, like that's the thing I often think about. That's my baseline when I think about it. And for you, it'll be a different place. Okay, here we go. I called you guests. You guys are not guests. Both of you are fellows of the Kogod Research Center at the Hartman Institute. Masua Sagiv is the Hartman Scholar in Residence of the Bay Area. She is the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley and a scholar of law who focuses on contemporary Judaism in Israel, as well as Jewish and democratic nature of the state of Israel. Welcome, Masua. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you.
Jim Loeffler is a senior fellow at the Kogod Research Center at Hartman, North America, and the Felix Posen Professor of Jewish History at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is a historian who focuses on law, culture, and politics in the modern Jewish period. And his current book project is on anti-Semitism and free speech. So that's going to come in handy tonight. So my first question is for both of you, just to kind of get us oriented, is tell us a little bit about what Jewish life is like on your particular campus. Paint the picture a little bit for us and how you've been navigating it. And Jim, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I think you just told us 80% of Jews go to college, and some of us go and never leave. So I've spent my whole adult professional life on campus in one or more places. And this was a very hard time. This is a very hard time this year. Not because everything was completely new, October 7th obviously was new, but many of the trend lines that we know about, the challenges about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on campus, those things I've dealt with, a lot of us have dealt with. But they hit home in a different way. It was also a hard year for me. You heard where I teach at Johns Hopkins University. I'm new there. For the last 18 years, I was teaching at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, including experiencing the 2017 white supremacist attack there. So it was very jarring to go to a new campus and deal with a new type of threat, a new type of challenge. And it was a hard year, but it was a hopeful year too. And as we'll talk about, my perspective was one in which I felt consistently there was a dynamic of curiosity and ignorance. The curiosity came through lots of people who really just wanted to understand. Students who came and said, we want to know more, including students who approached colleagues in Jewish studies and said, we want to hear more about the history of the conflict, and we don't want to just hear sound bites. And we'd like a course. We'd like if there to be a course where leaders of Jewish and Muslim and Arab student organizations can come together and learn something. That was a hopeful note that started. There was a lot of ignorance too, and there were a lot of issues that popped up right from the beginning in which you felt clearly that people really had no idea what was going on and how it was touching and reaching into the campus. And I'll give one example to kind of frame it. The director of Jewish Studies at Johns Hopkins University is from Kibbutz Kfar Aza. And so the most immediate news for me was that she lost family members, right, on October 7th. And the second question was, what can we do to support her? And so the whole Jewish Studies faculty ended up pitching in to teach her courses for several weeks. She wanted to keep going, but she had to stop and mourn and deal with the reality, as we all know was still unfolding. And we were struggling with figuring out, do we tell her, no, you don't teach anymore, we work with you, or we kind of step in. And her students, most of whom were not Jewish, had, in the class, she had no idea what was going on. So fine, so it's a kind of a heartening moment. But then, very quickly it emerges that there are protest sentiments on campus. A letter is being circulated around. And the letter was a letter which was very critical and one-sided about the conflict. Many things in it I would agree with about what the harm that Palestinian civilians in Gaza were and are suffering. But it was a letter that also left out basically October 7th, right? And left out the complexity and the full picture of it. So I went to talk to some colleagues about this. And what drove home to me the problem was that one of the colleagues I talked to, who was a very smart person who had signed the letter, said, well, I didn't really think about the anti-Semitism part of it because I hear so much about the vulnerability of Muslim Americans. I hear so much about the violence against Palestinian Americans, and there, you know, there was. And I didn't really think that was occurring here or that really affected anybody here. And I said, well, you might know that our colleague is from Kfar Aza. And then he said, well, yeah, I don't really know the situation. I mean, so she's a settler, and I don't know what that means. And then I realized we're really not having the same conversation I thought we were having. His assumption was that there's no distinction between someone living in the West Bank and someone living in the south of Israel. He doesn't know the map of it. And this is a very smart, educated person who wanted to get it right, he told me, but he just really ignorant. And when I said, you know, there have been some incidents on campus. In fact, there's a student here who had to get protection and had a death threat, and he had no idea. So what that drove home to me was that there's a lot of ignorance of just what is happening on any given campus. And some of the people who might end up being the protesters or the opponents of those of us who are strongly identified with Jewish life and Jewish studies may not even realize. There are plenty of bad faith actors out there that we know about, right? But there are many colleagues who either know nothing or they just reflexively say, well, this is a story, and it's a story in which powerful country, weak people, or this narrative or that narrative just kind of takes them away. The rest of the year was spent really trying to combat that. And as I'll say more as we go on, but I think the rest of the year was really spent trying to say, okay, in what ways can I educate my colleagues? In what ways can I educate the administrators who often know nothing also and are very scared of messing up? And how do I do that when people have commitments but really really poorly formed knowledge of this. I think that's a problem that's preceded this. I've often commented there's a problem that extends even to Jewish students who want to advocate for themselves and for Israel on campus and know very, very little about the actual history of it. So I'm hopeful because students did come in the first weeks and continue to come and say, we want to learn more, and we want to learn things that we can only learn here in the university. But it was a hard challenge nonetheless. Now you can hear about Berkeley.
So first, yes, you're going to hear about Berkeley, but I want to say something first. You mentioned Justus that this is the angle of faculty and the angle of Jewish community. I want to add that my angle is different and weird because I'm a visiting professor. I don't have tenureship. I'm an Israeli that is in the U.S. right now. I'm not a part of the circle of faculty that has any leverage on administration. And because of that, and definitely because of my work at Hartman, because I work half-time at Hartman and half-time at the university, I am very, very connected to students. So this is an insider-outsider angle, if you will, both on the American-Israeli and on the faculty, but not really faculty. And I like to say three things about the environment at Berkeley, the way I felt it this year. And I'll save you I'm pretty sure that all of the things that got to the news, you read. But what I do want to tell you is some of the things that maybe you haven't heard. So first, the campus is very divided, meaning there are definitely people that are that has complex views regarding the war and are not anti-Israel. There is definitely the anti-Israel movement, and there are people who just want to go and study and do what students usually do. But even though the campus is divided, what you see in public is almost completely one-sided. So if you walk around campus, you won't see that campus is divided. You have a group of Jewish students that try to have like this table where they have a few flags of Israel and they have a sign, ask me what you want about Zionism, unless someone tears it up for them or curse them or whatever, which all of these happen throughout the year. But what you may Thank you. That's also an experience in Berkeley, right? Like silencing. No. Yes, I didn't really joke. I wasn't really joking. What you see in your eyes and what you hear in your ear with your ears is only anti-Israel. Now, just an important note: the reason why I'm not saying pro-Palestinian and I'm saying anti-Israel is because I consider myself as pro-Palestinian and I have no space in this movement. Therefore, I call it what I see that it is. I don't think it is doing much good to the Palestinian cause. What it is anti-Israel. So that's number one. What you see in public is very different than what you see or hear on more private spaces. That's number one. Number two, I've heard in our podcast, Identity Crisis, I think it was a few months ago, where Yehuda spoke with Michal Biton about campus. And they tried to identify a division of what do we see, what do we feel. So they used the terms, Yehuda used the terms, unsafe versus uncomfortable, right? So I don't feel unsafe. I don't think that in general, Jewish students in Berkeley are unsafe. There were some incidents. I don't think that they are the norm of the situation in Berkeley. But I think it's much worse than feeling uncomfortable in Berkeley. And I can tell both from my experience and from what I hear from my students. By the way, I actually think that being uncomfortable in university is great because I don't want my students to feel comfortable when they're sitting in class. I think that Jewish students and faculty in general, and I know that I'm generalizing right now, but I think that Jewish faculty and students in Berkeley are unwell right now It's really, really hard to study. It's really, really hard to work. It's really, really hard to teach. When it's like a constant assault on all of your senses when you're in public spaces in Berkeley. I would have my own, longer roads to get into my class, to get into my building, to get into my office, so as not to encounter some of the larger protests. And the last thing I want to say is that what I've seen are 4 kinds of responses from Jewish students. So number 1 is trying the academic way, if you will, or what I see as the academic way. It's to try to create bridges between the different groups and try to understand and talk and have multiple viewpoints. My students who told me that they've tried this strategy completely failed in Berkeley, because the first rule of the encampment is do not engage with Zionists. So if you're a Zionist, we're not gonna speak with you at all. So I can't build a bridge with someone who refuses to engage with me at all. So engagement mostly failed. Number 2, and I say mostly just because I assume that I don't know all of them, but I kind of think it's all of it failed. Number 2 is we're gonna fight back. We're gonna fight back, and we're gonna reclaim the university. And there are definitely these kinds of groups and students. You don't see a lot of them in the public space. Number 3 is, listen, I'm out. That's not the reason I'm in the university. I came to the university. I don't want to engage with Israel. I don't want to engage even sometimes with my Judaism, and I know that's something that Hill directors and Hill professionals are dealing with right now. And number 4 is, okay, if society presents for me or models for me what it means to be a good Jew, and to be a good Jew is to be anti-Zionist. And I'm not saying that Jewish students who are anti-Zionist don't have their own, thinking and reasons, but there is a clear message of society on campus. If you want to be a good Jew, then be anti-Zionist, then denounce the state of Israel. So these are the kinds of responses that I see. I have to say, most of the students are in the just leave me. I don't want to engage with this in public. I'm not saying in private, but in public.
Okay, so my next question is a little bit more on the faculty perspective, and the way I want to ask it is this. How did you see your role, either as a visiting faculty or as a tenured faculty? Did you feel pushed to do things things on campus that you normally wouldn't have done, or did you want to push yourself? How did other Jewish faculty, what kinds of behavior did you see from them? Were you proud of that? Were you disappointed by it? Can you give us a little bit of that?
Sure. So definitely had new roles offered, or what's that word where you're when it's insisted but it's told as, would you please do this? What's that? Voluntold. Yeah, I was voluntold. But I'll give you a more concrete example of what happened for me. So shortly after, in early, mid-October, I got a call from the dean's office, and they said, we'd like you to come to a meeting. I know this is out of the box, but we'd like you and the head of Islamic Studies to co-teach a course on the history of the conflict. And I said, I've never met the head, I'm new here, right? And they said, well, just come to the meeting. So I went to the meeting. I knew about the voluntold before the meeting. My colleague didn't. So we get on this Zoom meeting, and they said, okay, you're here to teach the course. And she said, wait, what? What am I here for? And they said, we'd really like a course because we have, I mentioned, there's student demand. Okay, so students want something, and this is a good sign that they want to learn something. So could you guys start a course this week? And, we both looked at each other, and it was a great bonding moment, right? Because two academics say, wait a second, my syllabus, my preparation. So we went to talk, and we talked about it, and we had an interesting conversation, which was, surprise, surprise, we agreed about a lot, and we both said the right things. And then I said, I don't think I really can do this because I don't feel I know, I don't have enough lead time, but really I don't know exactly what the goal of this is. Is this course really to meet a small group of student leaders who've come to learn about this, or is this a PR exercise, you know, and I don't know you. And she said, I'm Iranian American and I can't do this because I've already gotten doxxed just for being Iranian here, and I'm afraid. And that was a revelation for me. So we happily went our ways, and the next week she did an event that I found pretty offensive, an event that I felt one-sided and sponsored a speaker, blah, blah, blah. But so I was asked to take on that role. But I went back with some colleagues to the same leaders of the university and said, okay, how about a course, but how about in the spring? We'll plan it out, and let's do a course on Gaza. And let's bring in an Israeli and Palestinian scholars who actually are experts in the history of Gaza, not the history of the conflict, but the history of Gaza as a place. And let's do a seminar, let's see what happens. So that course happened in the spring. You didn't hear about it because there was no controversy. It went, the people came, they learned. So I think that tells us something about the year as a whole. There were a lot of good things we didn't hear about because they were small improvisations to react to it. People being put in roles and trying to figure out how can I take advantage of this opportunity. I also did find myself in the role of sometimes being cast as Justus, you asked us about, what does it mean? Do people come to you and look at you differently? Definitely, all the more so, I'm sure, when you were an Israeli person, but as a Jewish studies person, you become the symbol of the Jews. And a lot of faculty would come and want to privately process emotions and feelings, Jewish faculty. I don't work on this area, but I know you do, and I know you feel it, and I want to kind of confide in you. And so there's a lot of peer-to-peer exchange. And there's a lot of other dynamics too, where you just find out you're left off the email chain, or, oh, you weren't invited to that meeting because of assumptions that because you're in Jewish studies, you must be X involving the conflict, you must think this way or that way. So that was a new role for me. And that was a new challenge to think about. And it raised the same question that Masua, you raised, which is, okay, so what do you do about it? Which one of those four am I? Right? Am I the one who wants to stand up and push the issue? Or am I the one who wants to try and quietly develop a rapport before I tell you where I stand on this? Or am I the one who wants to just sit it out? And I would say those different roles also comprise Jewish faculty's responses. Some say, I just want to teach my Gemara class, right? I'm not getting into it. Or if I open my mouth, what I'm going to say is so complicated, I know some Jewish students are going to be upset, even though I identify with the state of Israel. So all that role confusion was a big factor. I think what grounded me and many of us was the fact that ultimately our goal there and our reason for being there is to teach. So if the students come through the door, we do the work and we do the conversations that you can't have elsewhere on campus, and that we go back to that role, and that role I think will save us in the end.
So I'm going to both respond and say what I thought about the question, because I think it's a real it's a real question and a real challenge when you have two ways of action, right? One of them is more small scale. You see things, you have this course. I taught on spring semester, comparative constitutional law between Israel and the United States, and a lot of things came up there, including free speech on college campus, and in general this war, and there was an amazing group of students, but at the end it was 30 students, right? And it's not the mass, the big mass of students, right? And it's also the same question about do you stay in the closed rooms and try to reach achievements versus the administration, or you go outside and you protest and you try to be more vocal? And I think it's questions that don't have a clear answer. And I'll connect it to what I wanted to say before, is that when we speak about campus, usually we speak about students. And I think it's equally important not to forget faculty and staff. Because faculty and staff, they're not in the they didn't choose to be, the Jew or the Israeli, but they're there. They have put, I always knew that I'm gonna come as the Israeli or the Jew because that's actually what I do and what I teach. But think about the faculty or the faculty in computer science or the staff in mathematics or physics, right? They're the Jews, and especially if they're visibly Jewish. They're the either token Jew or more than that. And most of them are also, they're not trained. If there's one Jewish in smaller universities, right, or in smaller departments, there's one Jewish. Okay, so what do you say about anti-Semitism? What do you say about the state of Israel? What do you say about the conflict? I have no idea what to tell you. And also, a lot of faculty that I know, both from Berkeley and from other places, are feeling extremely lonely right now, even if they can be deans, right? So successful in their scholarship, but so incredibly lonely right now because they happen to be Zionists and believe that the state of Israel has a right to exist. I do gender and law. I have lost most, if not all, of my professional community that are not Jewish. I have one person left, actually, that is not Jewish because in my academic community right now, or the majority and vocal academic community, including people that I knew personally, including people that I considered as mentors before, the gender-based crimes on October 7th either didn't happen or weren't systematic or only sporadic, as if that changes something, and it was systematic. Or if it happened, it was justified because resistance in all means necessary. So to be in such an environment is so toxic, and it almost makes it impossible to continue to do what you want to do and what you're so good at doing, either teaching or researching. And maybe I'll just say one last thing about this. I actually don't mind Jewish faculty and staff and students being put in this position of being the Jew. Because as much as I would, it was really, really nice up to last year where we could, invest in our careers and do our thing, and our students could be studying whatever they want to study. I think it's okay to expect more from our fellow Jews, to be, I'm not going to say do aliyah and draft to the IDF, right? But I will say, be publicly Jewish. So I do think that we need better training for people who are able, for people who are, it's very overwhelming. I will never tell someone who is, unprepared to do that to be on this role. But actually, I'm not that worried, or I don't really mind for Jewish faculty and for Jewish students to be put in a position where they have to serve the Jewish people. And I know that it's not a very mainstream position in academia, but I also have to say that I always objected the disconnect between academia and community. I think it should have, I think the relationship should be stronger even before the war, definitely after October 7th.
All right, thank you both. You have one more thing
I
to
just
say,
want
Jim?
to, maybe I want to push back on one thing, because I hear what you're saying about there's a difference, right? Definitely. We go in a classroom, it's wonderful, the seminar table, we learn, and then we go outside, it's a different environment. But I would say the scale is a good thing, right? We live in a world in which everything has to be amplified and broadcast out. And many years ago, there was MOOCs, this idea of massive online courses. We're going to replace everything. You just took a course online. You didn't even need the classroom, right? But the virtue of the university is that while many other things happen, ultimately we're in that room, and it may be a small group, and it's the quality of it. To me, it's like Torah study, right? It doesn't depend on just mass production of it, and even if it is a smaller number, I think we should take that as a win. This issue did come up because, surprise, surprise, like with that course that we offered, it said, oh, can we record the course and put it online and do this and that? And it said no, because the people don't want to be online, right? They want to have a conversation they can't have anywhere else. So if we're achieving that, I think that is more important than what we've learned this year. Statements are not helpful, right? And statements only breed counter statements and that kind of stuff. That challenge, it doesn't go away, I'm not denying that, but ultimately I think it's a win if we are saying the students who are going to come into this classroom are going to be able to have a conversation they can't have anywhere else in the world, and they're going to be able to ask questions of themselves that they can't ask anywhere else in the world. So to me, it's not the only purpose, but that's something that I think tends to get lost because we project so much onto our universities, right? We look at them as the places which are supposed to represent us, or we look at them as the places that somehow are an extension of us because they take our dollars or they take our children, or we have relationships with them. But to me, keeping our eye on that aspect of the core, smaller, modest, but ultimately the most valuable part of it is something we can't let go of.
So can I just, I'm sorry, I totally hear that, but I am still very, and I think that, the example of this course, and again, the course that I experienced also, and I've heard of other courses by people, by different colleagues, I think this is university. This is how university should be. This is the model, and I wish we could duplicate it more and more. But I am still very concerned of what I see outside. I'll just give one example. On a few months ago, the students in Berkeley decided to have a vigil against anti-Semitism. So it wasn't about the state of Israel, it wasn't about the conflict, theoretically. It was just against anti-Semitism and against the breaking of rules by the anti-Israel group on campus, on the Berkeley campus. But behind the scenes, these students requested that no one fly the Israel flag during the vigil because it was an initiative of this vigil was of Jewish students. And they asked not to raise the Israeli flag because it might cause provocation. Now, what I see in this, and there was discourse and questions, and some faculty thought it was a bad idea. Some thought, especially after seeing what happened in UCLA, that maybe it was a good idea not to start provocation. But at the end of the day, what I see is this: the university is filled with Palestinian flags. So let's say I want to say, I don't want any flags. I don't want I kind of want political views on campus, but let's say I don't want any political views. But what I do see at the end is that we have one side that is very much out there, and we have one side that considers whether flying the Israeli flag is indeed provocation or not. And what I'm really concerned when we're focusing on, we need those small wins, and these classes are amazing, and they are amazing. But what I'm concerned is that if Israel and Zionism is just gonna become the third rail, right? So even if I'm not convinced, I want to stay out of it because it's so toxic and it's so provocation. And so Zionism becomes like a synonym to provocation itself. And that's something that I'm concerned of because it happens in parallel and at the same time that we have these small wins. And still we see this very toxic and almost violent environment, not violent, but feels like an...
Aggressive.
What?
Aggressive.
Aggressive, yes, thank you. An aggressive environment.
Okay, thank you both for that. I want to now bring it from the faculty to the kind of Jewish community view. And we're 7,000 to 10,000 miles away. So we have a chance to get on the balcony and elevate the conversation a little bit. I'm going to list for you issues or ideas that people think that the story is about? Is it, when I first thought of this question, I said, I think this is an analysis question. How do you analyze what's going on? But increasingly I'm thinking, no, actually it's a narrative question. In other words, what story do we choose to tell about, how are we interpreting the story, what story? And I think the reason this question is so important is because it should lead, the way we frame this story is then going to determine how we're going to act and how we're going to respond. So you might say the story is about free speech, or about discrimination, or about power dynamics, or about outside agitators, about rules not being enforced, about the misapplication of critical theory, the oppressed versus the oppressor narrative. These are all, right, I've seen all of these be really pushed up. So is there one or two of these that you think is the story that we as a Jewish community should focus on, or that you think is a complete misapplication of understanding what's going on? Help us understand the story a little bit as you see it, so that it can shape how we respond more intelligently.
Okay. So one you haven't mentioned, I'll start with, and this is a narrative you're not going to be surprised for me to bring it up, which is there's a narrative, there's a storyline, which is the problem is Jewish studies. The problem is the Jewish community is invested in higher education, creating all these wonderful positions, and now all those people have turned against Israel, and they are an enemy from within. I think that's I think it's a myth. I think it's a seductive story because it feels like, well, we can't control what's happening there, but we can control it if we give our money to Hillel or Chabad or a different organization that intervenes to help students. There we know it's just reaching them. I think it's inaccurate, actually. The vast majority of Jewish studies professionals, and I've been on listserv this year with Jewish studies directors from around the country, they feel deeply committed to getting the story right, of telling the truth about Judaism and Jewish experience, as well as they're not all Jewish. They feel deeply committed to Jewish students and Jewish life and being a resource and a complementary instrument, right, of education and support. But I think it takes over because it represents a larger sense of do we really trust academia as a whole? And, you know, are we so wounded and suspicious that we feel like if we give people the tools to bring the complexity, they'll only use it against us? When it comes to what is happening and the other things you listed on campus, my view is that it is part of a larger dynamic in which we have turned to the campus and we have turned to the question of Israel-Palestine to think through some fundamental questions that America and American society and the world have been grappling with for many years now. And the way I would put it is that we've had this strange moment of realignment, right? We have progressives who for many years were focused on the power of speech, on hate speech, on microaggression, and things of that nature, are now saying free speech, First Amendment, this is the most important value for democracy. And you have conservatives who've long said those oversensitive lefties who want to, you know, censor speech and shut things down, can't take the truth too much about their feelings, are suddenly saying, wait a second, that is harmful and that is all a threat that we need to stop. And I think we have many of us who are in the middle between those, the liberals who are confused. And really confused about what we want free speech to do. It's not only because of us, it's also because we're looking at social media and we're grappling with an environment where there's so much horrible stuff that circulates, but do we want to regulate that? It's a situation in which we believe in the right to protest. This is a part of the DNA of American Jewry, the idea of protesting for Soviet Jewry, the idea that we show up on the mall out of solidarity with Israel in a time of need, and yet we look at protest and we say that's not the right kind of protest, right? Or that's disturbing, or that's threatening, or that's illiberal. So I think that there are larger issues that are getting mapped onto it. So what's really going on? We're projecting a lot onto it. And it's not just us, it's many different communities and groups. I think that also explains some of the protest. If you look at some of the language that people are talking about, some of it is genuine outrage and concern for violence. Some of it is actually, and I think this is often missed, anti-war, anti-militarism. Some of the groups, we have a lot of attention about which groups and outside actors, but the groups that have been pushing some of these issues for a few years now are explicitly anti-militarism. And so there are leftist groups who've said, after all the wars America's been involved in, we want to focus on something we can stop. So what I think is, it's all being dumped onto the university, all being projected onto it. And sometimes it's about us, and sometimes we're just the symbol with which people are going to really work through their frustrations, their anger, their questions.
So I don't think it's about us almost at all. I think it's about,
Us meaning Jews?
yes,
Okay.
or Israel. I think it's about the West. From what I'm seeing, it's not anti-militarism. It's anti-everything that the West represents right now, and it could be, power or nationalism or even or clear categories or borders. And it's hard because I agree and disagree with you at the same time, because I also see, or I want to highlight also the clear double standard that I'm seeing in universities, because some of the things that, or some of the statements, or a lot of the statements that I've been seeing in these protests, should they have been directed at not all other groups, but a lot of other groups, it would have been shut down very, very quickly, as we've, we are talking about microaggression all the time, and we're talking about believing people all the time, unless it's us deciding how to define anti-Semitism, then it's too much and it's exaggerated, or us deciding, or us saying, that we were assaulted on October 7th, and then, oh, no, maybe you asked for it, right, because you're an occupier. So I think part of the problem is that different actors use different narratives. So we don't really have a conversation or an argument on the same narrative, but we're on completely different levels. I, for example, think that, and I'm not going to talk about Jewish studies professors, but I actually think that Jewish faculty that are anti-Zionists are a real problem. I'm not saying we should fire them. I'm not saying we should, I'm just trying to present a situation, because, I went to Hillel at Berkeley at some point to have a conversation whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, just so you won't be in tension. I'll say that the answer was no, but that's not what I want to tell right now. I gave the talk, and throughout the talk, I also criticized the Israeli government for statements and for actions. And at the end of the conversation, a group of Jewish students came to me and said, by the way, a different student who was on the board of Hillel resigned because I came to give the talk, and because the description of the conversation, I said the word anti-Semitism. So there are two. Everyone are it's like the tension is present in every level of the university. Anyway, they came to me at the end of the conversation, and they told me, how can you stand here and criticize Israel? Don't you know that everything that you say against Israel will be used against us in a way that is not fair? It's not when you're saying it in a complex and a nuanced way, and and you say that yes, Israel has a right to self-determination, but I have a lot of questions about how this war is conducted, which is my actual opinion. But I'll just say that is when Jewish professors come and say, there's a professor from Hebrew University that goes around Twitter, and I assume that a lot of other places, and say, as an Israeli historian, here is why I can prove to you that Israel's committing genocide. And because he's an Israeli and because he's a Jew, there's more credibility to what he says in those circles. So yes, I think it is actually a real problem. And I'll just say the last thing, I don't think it's about free speech at all. And I think that the fact that we cooperate with this narrative is a huge mistake, because free speech is standing and protesting. Free speech is not preventing access from different areas on campus. Free speech is not graffitiing over all of the buildings or preventing access to a building. This is not free speech. Free speech is not preventing the flying of the flag of Israel, even if you don't like it, right? So the question for me is, if there are rules of the university, and these rules are not being followed, what are we gonna do about it? And you know what? I don't even claim against the students like I do, but it doesn't matter. Students can act the way they act. What I am very troubled with is the response by the administration, or I shall say the lack of response by the administration. And it's not that the administration doesn't sit with the Jewish professors and the Jewish students. No. We only last week or the week before, the Jewish faculty or the Jewish people on campus got a letter from the chancellor telling us how much she feels for us and how much she now doubles down on Jewish studies and on Israel studies and on the anti-Semitism initiatives. But this letter only got to the Jewish faculty and the Jewish students and the Jewish staff. It's not out there where everyone can see. And when I talked about the encampment with some of my colleagues, what's happening? Why is it not being taken down? Because clearly it is against university rules. I was told by my colleagues, next week they go on summer break. It'll filter down. And I think it's almost naive. It's not gonna go anywhere unless we actually do something about this. So it's just gonna, if this war will continue, and this is for another topic, right? Like concerns about the war is for a different panel and a different evening. But if this war is not gonna end, forget about, we did an agreement with the encampment, so we won't see any encampment anymore. That's not gonna happen.
So I'll just respond. I don't think calling out hypocrisy gets us very far. There's a lot of double standards. I wrote a book about human rights and international law and this whole problem about uneven application. And I think what you're describing is a real problem. But I don't think that we get very far if we just say, why didn't you enforce your rules over there? We have to say, what do we want it to look like going forward? And I think that's the real challenge. I think we have to be able to tell a story about what we want to look like on campus and what we want it to look like going forward. The way I think about it also has a lot to do with, now we've had a wave of legal lawsuits and we've had some legal actions and agreements, Michigan, CUNY, NYU, right, Berkeley, all these places. So what happens in them is, if you look in the agreements, consistently they say, almost across the board, they say administrations did not respond properly, did not take seriously complaints about anti-Semitism. What is then the remedy? Sensitivity training, so that we give administrators and students more education and more awareness about anti-Semitism. So one way to think about that is to say, there is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. People are very skeptical about it because they say maybe it doesn't have space for Jews. But then the solution to dealing with anti-Semitism is saying more DEI. And I think we have to decide if we think that some of the models about education and responding to bias that are pre-existing on campus are insufficient or even compromised, or whether they're just not inclusive enough. Because we have to say, is it that we want the rules to change or we want the rules to be consistent? We have to be able to tell something which isn't simply, that's not fair. And it isn't fair, right? And we all experience it and we see it in different ways. But I know if I go to my colleagues and I say, it's not fair what they did, many colleagues will say, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of stuff that's not fair at this university. Did you see what they just did with our parking? And did you see what they did with our teaching responsibility? And did you see what they did with they changed the whole policy on this? So I think we have to have a more positive vision, which is saying, you colleagues, you're not Jewish, you're Jewish, but you're ambivalent. You have a stake in this. We can get this right, but we're going to have to ask for this. And I would say that the good news is, and we may not agree on this, the good news is there are a lot of other communities inside the academy that are also struggling with these questions. There are Asian Americans in America who are struggling with trying to figure out what kind of minority are we, how do we think about racial politics, what do we think about bias on campus. This year, I learned about a brewing controversy involving allegations that there were instructors who won't stop talking about the Chinese genocide of the Uyghurs. And there were Chinese students who said that's deeply offensive. And you're discriminating because when you bring it up, you ask me to explain China, even though I'm Chinese American. And for me, it was like, oh, so there are other people experiencing parallel things. We may be in the eye of the storm right now, but if we want to think about where we want to be in 10, 20 years, it's going to have to be thinking about who are our allies and what kind of system of response and equity and care and speech we want for our campuses. So to me, there's a danger that we only focus on how bad it is and how inconsistent it is, instead of saying, okay, we see the flaws, now we're going to give a vision of what we can get right. You may not agree.
No, I agree very much. What I want from this, because I know that there are attempts all the time, there are attempts being made all the time, that are educational and that are visionary. What I'd like us to be better at is with the flow of information between what happens in the closed rooms between administration and senior Jewish faculty and the students and the Jewish community, and to have the support in order for universities to have the support to do that visionary job or visionary initiatives. We need
100%.
partners not only in the universities but also in the community and definitely within the students.
100%. I would say, though, the way to do that is, I think you asked us about the community. The community should say, open these channels of dialogue, right? This year I got emails from parents across the country, not because they had a connection to my university. They saw something I wrote. I did a Hartman event, and they had questions. Can you tell me about X or Y? I answered all those emails. Of course. I want to help. Sometimes I say, you just got to talk to Professor so-and-so, is a friend of mine, wonderful scholar of Talmud, go talk to her, right? But I think rather than circulate clips from social media and saying, I'm outraged by what I'm seeing, or I'm going to sign that statement or demand that the university do something, reach out more directly to the professors, right? People are accessible, and I think that's another way to think about it. If you say, here's the conversation I want to have, what courses are you actually offering? If I send my kid there next year, I'll talk to the Hillel about climate and this and that. Tell me, what can they learn? What will they learn from you? And by the way, what will they learn if they want to study the modern Middle East, right? To me, that's a kind of way of leaning in and asking, challenging faculty, be helpful in this situation, but challenging in a way of saying, I want to know what you do. I want to know what's available. I want that small class to be opened up more, right? Rather than simply kind of, I don't see it, and so I assume the worst.
And maybe that's a good time to also say that by no means what I said so far should imply that I think that we should give up on universities that are more problematic, quote unquote, right? I think that it is so crucial for us not to give up on universities, even if it's really, really bad right now, because we have fought for a long time in order to get into these places. We might want to be in a better position in these places right now. We might need to work, within the Jewish community on how to, on some of the disagreements that we may have, even though we don't really have disagreements. But we definitely shouldn't give up on sending our kids or our community members to universities. And definitely, but be more active, be more engaged, be more, more chutzpanim, I guess, than maybe our natural tendency.
All right, so you basically answered my last question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and let's keep our responses short because I want to get to your questions, which is, we've invested massive amounts as a Jewish community in these institutions, right? We send our kids there in overwhelming numbers. We've put hundreds of millions of dollars into endowing Jewish studies positions. We have built an infrastructure of student support through the Hillel movement that is massively greater than any other minority or majority community on campuses. Should we be rethinking any of the, after what happened in the last 9 months, should we be rethinking any of that, or should we be changing any of that, or is it just, we can't always control what goes on campus. The campus is still the place for Jewish growth of young adults in that place. Have you changed your mind on investing in universities?
So since I answered most of what I want to say, I'll just say, well, no, that's first. Number two, I do think that what we need to do, and I think that we have started to do it at Hartman, is offer more support not only to our students but also to our faculty. We know that a lot of people, a lot of Jewish faculty came to Hartman and said, like, we need help us understand how to be better representatives for the Jewish people, and that's what a program that we're starting from this close winter, next winter, whatever in English.
January.
And the third thing that I want to say is that even though we're not talking about Hillel right now, and you'll speak about this on Monday, our Jewish organizations on campus are so important. They are overwhelmed right now. And we have a tendency, like I just said, bi chutzpanim, but bi chutzpanim towards the outer world, not towards ourselves, because we have a tendency to be like, oh, why is there only one flag of Israel in this Hillel and not 5 flags of Israel like I think should happen? And I am not joking, my friends. I am not joking. These kinds of conversations happen all the time. So or even with our Jewish faculty that are having conversations with the administration, even if I disagree with them, they really need, we really need for you to have our backs and to be generous towards us as we are facing, and for sure we're making mistakes all the time. So we need your support and definitely engagement, but also, be kind.
Be kind. I like that. Yeah, I'm just going to say one more thing about this, which is, obviously, I do not think it's the time to give up on the university or the role of Jewish studies and Jewish faculty, Israel studies. I also think that people sometimes forget it's not only about our community, our kids. Most of my students are not Jewish. Most of the students who take my classes are not Jewish. And many of the Jewish students who come because they want to be able to learn with their peers in a different context. It's not Hillel. They love Hillel. Maybe they're not Hillel people, but they want to learn about themselves, their past, and want to understand how it relates to the world around them. So if you want, there's this narrative about, like, look at these protest people, they're the future of this country, we're all in trouble. The other way to think about it, look at the 95% of the students who are not in those protests. Those are the future of our country too. So if you want to have people who actually understand something about the Jewish experience, this is the way it's going to happen through the university. And I do believe it's possible to do that. And I think most students, curiosity is really the driver. They want to learn, right? They, like us, live in the soundbite culture. They, like us, see the clips. But if they're going to come to take a class, they want to learn. So leaning into the university is giving people a chance to learn about us too.
All right, let's see what questions we have from you all. We're going to have microphones coming around, and let me see where my colleagues are.
Hi, thanks. I'm Sammy Baird. 2 linked questions. One, in thinking about the positions that are eloquently, carefully put by people with ample and substantial learning and expertise and appropriate primary sources, to what extent is it really incumbent upon you to both provide faculty, colleagues, and a wider community a framework that embraces the works of people like Magid and Baird, who are, from perhaps the perspective of many of us sitting here, have views that are problematic but cannot be easily or simply written off, and who are known in the wider world and in the wider community? How do we recognize that while there is indeed ignorant, anti-Semitic, poorly founded, poorly researched critique of Israel. There is critique which is none of those things, and be really clear to be open, receptive, and responding appropriately to such questions. And Justin, let me pause there, enough.
So our job is to teach people to think critically. So what I say about this is, generally speaking, I want my students to be able to read any text and understand this has evidence, this doesn't, right? This is overly ideological at the expense of clarity of argument or just, capture of truth. So I also don't want them to feel like there are things which are trafe or taboo because there must be some reason I'm holding it back from them. And in my experience, students want to see the full range of opinion out there, and they want to make sense of it. And I don't think we have to worry as much as we might think about that. I'm not I have colleagues who will probably say things that I find offensive or do things that shouldn't put their finger on the scale. But the goal, I'm not worried about any one author. I'm thinking about how do I make sure these students, God, I hate to say it, but that they still want to read, right? God forbid they don't want to read, or that they say, well, I just don't have time to read the whole thing. What we're doing really is humanistic inquiry, and our culture doesn't really, we say we want that, but we really don't, have quite the attention span for it now. We want to get right to the point. Sometimes you have to read the wrong stuff to understand what the right stuff is.
And just the only thing that I'll add is that I think that the classic sense of critical thinking and critical studies is the best experience that a classroom could have. So when I would love to have these authors in my classroom together with other authors and to speak in an environment where these discussions should happen, which is the environment of the classroom or the, whatever, colloquium, if it's at the faculty level, as long as it's being critically analyzed and treated. I think that's the best case scenario that we have, that we don't have these tropes, but we have serious claims that we can treat and discuss and have nuance and all of these things. So in this, welcome to my class.
And I would just add that Jewishly developed anti-Zionist ideological movements are as old as Zionism itself, and what's going on now is not new. There may be some new versions of it that come out, and I think that our Jewish communities can handle them for sure. Let's get 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we'll respond. Okay, got a microphone coming over here, and let me see, do I have a couple other hands just to put in queue?
Just first of all, thank you for all that you do on campus. You faculty and Hill directors are the real heroes in terms of what's been going on here in America. My question is it a myth that at many of our elite universities and colleges, both public and private, that there is systemic DEI in the classroom, that academics are more interested in activism than providing a venue for exchange of marketplace of ideas and critical thinking. And this has now been exposed as we've seen all of these protests on campuses, where it's not about having dialogue and debate, it's about shutting people down and about creating safe spaces and trigger warnings for some groups, but not for others.
Okay, great. And I think Jessica has a question. Pass the mic back.
Thanks. I'm Jessica Kirshner. I'm the director of Hillel at Stanford. I don't know if we're heroes, but that's nice. I have a question that's adjacent, but I think different, that I have learned in the 7 years I've been on campus that faculty hold an enormous amount of culture and power in the university, much more than students, and there's a focus on students, I think because we all remember being students and most of us are not faculty, but the student lifespan at the university is very short and the faculty lifespan is very long, so it holds an enormous amount of cultural power. and a real reluctance among faculty to sort of check each other or to check junior faculty. And I'm concerned, I love the spirit of inquiry, and I'm concerned about its absence in a number of departments and professional cohorts, and maybe especially among younger faculty. And I'm sort of wondering what can be done faculty to faculty that might help shift that dialogue so that they are fostering a spirit of greater inquiry and balance that I'm seeing right now.
Okay, one more over here.
Michael Belinsky. To get on camera. I would have showered. In terms of faculty and and related to Hillel, where I spent part of my career, Hillel was always for students, but my sense of some of the years of the past and Hillel is far better today, but there was my perception of a greater sense of, and before Jewish studies was so large, Jewish intellectual life also took place at Hillel. And now my sense is the focus is much more student-centered. So talking about we're having a program for faculty in January, is there a way to think about having someone on campus that can really work with faculty that emerges out of the frame of Hillel? And so that it's not just the student place, but it really becomes more of that resource for faculty who, as described, could really use it.
Okay, you guys want to start?
I think this is complex because, on the one hand, the first year that an Israeli comes to teach in an American campus, I feel like I should have been better prepared. Because I definitely said a few things in class that that were not culturally accepted, but were very culturally accepted in Israel. I think there is kind of like an inner censorship in class. Almost, you cannot. I said before that I think that part of learning is being uncomfortable. You can almost never put your students in an uncomfortable place. That's like the environment, on the one hand. But on the other hand, I actually found, it took me some time, but I actually found that it's pretty easy to find ways around this to make students feel uncomfortable in the positive way. And I think that it is part of what's really, really beautiful about university is that you don't come to a one-off session. You can build a relationship with your class. And, at the beginning of the spring semester, I said, we're not gonna talk about the war at all until you trust me and until I trust you. And it took us some classes, and then gradually you could see one of my students was an activist in the encampment, which was very rare. I thought it was beautiful that she came and took the class. She was a brilliant student. I didn't know at first that she's an activist, and it took a while until she trusted me to come around mid-semester. She came with the pins and the shirts and whatever, and then later she started speaking about it. So it was a process, and you can have a process on your class. And at least in our kinds of studying, I don't know how you teach physics, right? But in our kinds of studies, whether it's law or history or Judaism or Jewish studies, I don't really believe in neutrality and in objectivity. I don't believe that any professor comes in as a blank slate. So you can call it activism, but what I think that as long as a professor says, I have a view, but I'm gonna raise all other views. I'm gonna raise the other view, and I want you to push me, you the students, I want you to push me. And if there is a really open environment in the classroom, and I think, you know, I've had so many of those when students would definitely say to me, I think I think differently. And I make sure to always say, this is where I tend to, but here's the other view, and the other view has merits too. I think that as long as we do that, I don't have a problem with activism in the classroom. If we don't have that, and if activism is not transparent, then I think it's definitely a problem.
You know, thinking about these three questions, it's striking me, the university is a beautiful place. It's also a place where so many members of it feel aggrieved and disempowered, even if they do have power. Maybe it's a little bit like American society, right? Where so many different constituencies, communities feel like, well, we have no control over things, it's only those people. So it's striking in the university context, when you bring up DEI, you know, there are many people who view the DEI people as having a lot of power, but when you've talked to those people who actually fill those roles, they often say, we're kind of like Toby in The Office. We're the people that no one takes seriously here because we really have lots of ideas until the bean counters come in and say, well, that's, you know, that's irrelevant, right? And we feel like we're tokens. And you talk to professors, and professors do have a lot of authority and power, and they can really shape minds. But then there are also times in which professors feel like, I don't have any control here, right? And not because of a rigid or ideological orthodoxy, but because they just take away my resources, or we don't have control over our budgets, or, you know, this or that. So the challenge is, I think, to get people to recognize the power they do have, to use it responsibly, and also to see themselves not as in a kind of a competition, but a partnership with different parts of the university. It is very hard, and I think there was a question about junior faculty too. They are pushed in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes, just like in any job, the way you get ahead is you conform, and you conform to what you believe is the script of what you're supposed to do until you have job security, and that's not always a good thing. This year I've dealt with junior faculty who really are worried about retribution. Because of what they fear might happen to them because of the blowover and the crossover of the conflict into the campus. And so, and I can tell them, you're really not in trouble, you're really going to be fine. But people are insecure. How do you do that? Maybe one way you do that is you try and build more links and ties between parts of the university, and maybe that also includes places like Hillel and Jewish Studies and Conversation. That's also complex, right? Because we don't serve exactly the same constituency, but I do think there's an opportunity there to break down those barriers, and to give students who are active there a chance to learn more about Jewish studies, because as you may all know, not everyone wants to come to our classes. They say, oh, I have a day school background, I don't need that, right? Or they say, I'm intimidated by that, how could I ever do that? I'm not that kind of person. So I think those are questions to think about so that people all feel more inspired and less aggrieved and insecure in how they approach what they do, because these are living communities and institutions that are trying to figure out how to take care of their staff, faculty, and their students.
Okay, I have a closing comment, and then I want to tell you about a small gift we have for you on your way out, and then we're going to thank our two brilliant speakers. So without trying to make this an advertisement for Hartman, to answer the question on faculty, I'll just say that the Institute has a decade of investment in campus. In fact, the Jewish professional leaders that Hartman invested in soon after rabbis, like rabbis were always the first love of the Hartman Institute to bring, but then after that it was really Hillel professionals, and so for a decade we've been working with them, and then we started working with students. There's thousands of college students who've studied in this Beit Midrash behind us. And more recently, we've always had faculty in our research center, but more recently we've understood that there are Jewish faculty who are being asked to play leadership roles on campus, and they don't necessarily have a community or a place to think about what that role looks like outside of their academic role. And so we are, what was mentioned is we are experimenting with a pilot for those faculty. I'll also say there's an organization called the Academic Engagement Network, which has hundreds of faculty. It's a little bit more of an advocacy network, Jewish and non-Jewish faculty alike who are pro-Israel. Okay, so a year ago, in this courtyard, in these rooms in the Beit Midrash, we brought together 20 amazing Hillel professionals from the International Center and from the field, and we said, what would it look like to advance thought leadership for the Hillel movement? And we did it with the hope of eventually producing an issue of our journal sources with those ideas. And so I'm happy to say that a few days ago they came from the printer and they are here and they're online. If you want to hear a more Hillel professional voice, if you want to see the winners of our student essay contest, if you want to hear another faculty perspective, and if you're a reader, they're all in this great issue. I encourage you to take a look at it. And again, on Monday after lunch, you'll have a chance to hear from some Hillel rabbis. With that, let's thank Jim and Masua.
Thank you, Justus.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess.
Okay, you can get a copy there and by the back camera if you want to grab a copy of the journal. And thank you all for being here tonight.